Counter-narrative news, continuing with our special series on Walter Rodney, taking extracts at this moment from the book Walter Rodney Speaks, published by Africa World Press back in 1990. This section is called Travel to the Soviet Union and Cuba. Start quote. Yet I don't really think in that period of 1960 to 63 I had any serious awareness of the need to not simply to study black history in Africa, but to go beyond that and to see it from a different illogical perspective. There were, however, a number of experiences that were useful. One was travelling and visiting places. When I travelled to the Soviet Union, I was struck on arrival at the airport by the physical demeanour and the social aspect of the people in the airport. They were workers and peasants, and as far as I could see, who were flying on those Tu-104s to Moscow, to Leningrad, etc., as though they were using a bus. And my understanding of an airport was that it was a very bourgeois institution. There was only certain of us who were supposed to be in an airport, but the Soviets seemed to have ascended beyond that. That was what one confronted going into the country. And then, having left the airport, one goes out into the streets and one is amazed at the number of books they sell in the streets, on the pavement, all over. In my society, you have to search for a bookstore and be directed and told that the bookstore is down that street, as if it's an alien institution. And even in America, one can buy hot dogs and hamburgers on the sidewalks, a lot of nice things like that, but not books. And it seemed to me that there was something different about this Soviet society. There was also something different about seeing ordinary people going into the Bolshoi Ballet, because I had previously been to London and I had passed by the West End and I had seen the London upper classes going to their opening night performances. Again, the difference was striking. Those things remained with me, and they still do. Travelling to Cuba was also another important experience, because I was with the Cuban students and I got some insight at an early period into the tremendous excitement of the Cuban Revolution. This was 1960, just after the victory of the revolution. One has to live with a revolution to get its full impact, but the next best thing is to go there and to see a people actually attempting to grapple with real problems of development. Cuba was a different dimension from the Soviet Union because the Russians had made their revolution and were moving along smoothly. But the Cubans were up and about, talking and bustling and running and jumping and really living the revolution in a way that was completely outside of anything that one could read anywhere or listen to or conceptualize in an island such as Jamaica, which is where I was still. The Cuban experience was very good. I was fortunate in visiting Cuba twice, only for brief periods, but long enough to get that fire and dynamic of the Cuban Revolution. It has bothered me for a decade and a half and remains a constant bugbear still that the West Indian intellectual class was so lazy that it never seriously attempted to come to grips with the Cuban experience. It seemed to me that whatever was going on there, it was clearly important enough to warrant analysis, if nothing else. And yet here we were in our intellectual debasement. One result was that whenever we might marginally touch upon socialism in discussion, it was an abstraction, for we could never relate to the fact that some people were actually about building a socialist society 90 miles away. I didn't say that it was this that made me a Marxist, but it was one of the little levers which, in looking back on it, probably did help my moving in a different ideological direction. End of quote. Fascinating comments there. Yes, very much. The Soviet Union in the 1960s was still a socialist society, despite whatever kind of going back to certain forms of right-wing politics, as was indicated in the transfer of leadership from Lenin to Stalin. But yeah, absolutely, it was still a society in which there was much more relative equality around access to education, clearly transport as well, what Walter Rodney is sharing. Obviously, there's more critical remarks, particularly from CLR James on the Soviet Union, and Counter-Narrative News will share that in due course from CLR. And then on the Cuban, yeah, anyone who's been to Cuba will know that it's still very much the case that there's a lot of running and jumping and bustling about amongst the Cuban masses around and just the general culture, but the socialist culture of Cuba as well. And yeah, Cuba is an island in the Caribbean, only 90 miles away from Jamaica, as Walter Rodney is correctly stating, and very much really important part of the revolutionary kind of experiences and histories of the Caribbean people in resisting imperialism and towards socialism.